So, Netflix recently dropped another season of Ryan Murphy's, let's be honest, somewhat morally questionable serial killer anthology Monster, this time focusing on the butcher of Plainfield, Wisconsin, Ed Gein, whose unimaginable depravity inspired Hollywood horror icons like Norman Bates, Buffalo Bill, and of course, Leatherface. That's enough of a connection to warrant a deep dive into this movie, right? I mean, the show literally has a sequence where Ed Gein runs around and dances with a chainsaw after killing someone, so I guess, you know, that's enough, right? That's enough for me. So, to celebrate the Halloween season and Ed Gein's unfortunate pop culture comeback, let's take a look at the film that he directly inspired and reshaped horror filmmaking forever. In 1974, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre hit theaters and audiences were completely unprepared. The film is about a small group of friends traveling through rural Texas who stumble upon an isolated farmhouse, and inside, they find a family of former slaughterhouse workers who have turned their butcher skills onto humans instead of livestock. That's the simple version, but beneath the surface, it's an allegory about the death of the American dream, the collapse of industry, and the violence simmering just beneath polite society. This movie isn't about monsters. It's not like the Wolfman or Frankenstein or anything that came before it. It's directly about what happens to civilization when it rots away. And honestly, it feels just as relevant now as it did 50 years ago. Hooper's inspiration came from two real stories that collided in his imagination. First, a story from his family doctor about a medical student who once skinned a cadaver's face, cured it, and wore it to a Halloween party. What a fucking weirdo. It's one of those stories that feels like an urban legend, but for Hooper, it never stopped echoing in his mind. And then there was Ed Gein, the infamous Wisconsin murderer who decorated his home with human remains he stole from local graveyards. Hooper's relatives had lived not far from Gein's hometown in Wisconsin, and when he was a child, they told him stories about a man who lived in the next town over who dug up graves. They didn't say his name. They didn't have to, said Hopper. To him, Ed Gein was a real-life boogeyman. Years later, all of the pieces of his life, his weird doctor, the Wisconsin rumors, the Vietnam War on TV, they all fused into this incredibly cinematic idea. It's a monster that's not born out of fantasy or superstition. It's reality. Leatherface isn't a supernatural being. He's one of us. At one point, he was an American citizen. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre was made for about $140,000, which is an impossibly small sum even in the 1970s. Every frame of this movie is what happens when creative limitation becomes creative power. Hooper shot in the blazing Texas summer heat, often with no permits, no air conditioning, and no plan. The actors have since said that they had to wear the same costumes day after day because the production couldn't afford replacements. The smell, made up of sweat, fake blood, and the real decaying animal carcasses around them, became so thick that several crew members routinely vomited or passed out, especially during filming of the infamous dinner scene. Edwin Neal, who plays the hitchhiker, later said, "Filming that scene was the worst time of my life, and I had been in Vietnam with people trying to kill me, so I guess that shows how bad it was." Even the voice that opens the movie was part of that DIY spirit. John Larroquette, who delivers the chilling opening narration, was reportedly not paid in cash, but paid in a single joint. That's how small this film was. But it's also about how pure the filmmaking is. I mean, I know a lot of people got hurt while making this, and I am absolutely not excusing that, but there is something nice about the idea of just getting a group together, getting a camera, and making your idea a reality. Every sound, every image, every prop, every scream, it's all very real out of necessity. When the film was finally completed, the filmmakers faced another problem: distribution. Nobody wanted to touch this thing. Enter Bryanston Distribution Company, a studio with ties to the Colombo crime family, unfortunately. The same organization that funded the infamous adult film Deep Throat, which is a whole nother video I don't think I'll ever touch on this channel.
Have you ever taken a penis all the way down to the bottom of your throat?
What the fuck?
It was through these mob-backed profits that the Texas Chainsaw Massacre found its way into theaters, and predictably, most of that amazing return on investment money vanished. The cast and the crew were paid almost nothing, and the film's profits were siphoned off into the underworld. Luckily for everyone involved, years later the team discovered who they'd really been working with, and after a lawsuit they all received $25,000 in cash. It's not a lot, but it's something, and it's a story as grim and strange as the film itself. It's an American masterpiece born of exploitation, passion, and organized crime. It does not get more American than this. Luckily, it seems like everybody involved in making this movie gets properly compensated every time the franchise gets new ownership. So not only did they get paid a few decades ago, but they're going to get paid again because A24 is currently, at the time of recording, the frontrunners to land this franchise. Boom, bonus thing you never knew. I could not be more excited. The movie's marketing famously claimed that it was based on true events, which was obviously a lie, but it wasn't a careless one. Hooper deliberately leaned into that deception as commentary. In the wake of Vietnam and Watergate, Americans had grown completely distrustful of authority. Hooper saw horror as a mirror, and he wanted his audience to confront what it meant to live in a world where truth and terror were interchangeable. That lie became a part of the film's language. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre wasn't real, quote unquote, but it felt so real. The handheld cinematography, the washed out colors, the grain of his 16mm film, all of it blurred the line between fiction and documentation. It looked like a nightmare someone could have filmed from, across the way. Okay, so what if I told you that the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, notoriously one of the most intense watches you could ever find in cinematic history, was originally intended to be rated PG? It sounds almost impossible, but Tobe Hooper's goal was deliberate, to lie on suggestion and restraint rather than overt gore. Ironically, that very restraint became the film's most powerful weapon. Hooper himself later joked that the movie used maybe 2 ounces of blood. Yet the result feels far bloodier and far more violent than most films twice its budget, and it sits in the collective consciousness of all of us who've watched it as a much more violent film than it actually objectively is. A chainsaw never actually tears into someone's flesh on screen. Nearly all of the horror and violence is implied, forcing the audience's imagination to fill in the blanks. The MPAA initially rejected this approach, handing down an X rating despite everything they did, and it was eventually, with lots of cuts and reworks, brought down to an R, but by then the film's terrifying reputation was already cemented. Even with the final rating, some countries still banned this thing for extreme violence, and while many contemporary critics at the time just flat out dismissed the film as mere shock value, Stephen King famously defended it, writing, "I would happily testify to its redeeming social merit in any court in the country." What a fucking guy. Before it became the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the film's working title was actually Headcheese. I know, it's a bizarre name, but thematically it is on point. Headcheese is a real dish made from the boiled scraps of a pig's head. When Franklin tells Pam that she'd probably like head cheese if she didn't know how it was made, that line sets up the metaphor the entire movie is going for. It's a metaphor for modern society's selective blindness. That line is the movie. It's about ignorance and comfort. It's about how modern society hides the brutality behind the things we consume, whether it's meat, media, war, whatever we consume without questioning. We hide the process behind polite packaging. In the early 1970s, Americans were seeing the Vietnam War broadcast straight into their living rooms for the first time ever. It was sanitized, it was edited, but it was unmistakably ultra-violent, and Hooper's film took that same confrontation and turned it into cinematic language. This is what we've chosen not to see. Gunnar Hansen approached Leatherface not as a monster, but as a deeply human, if not profoundly damaged, character. He and Tobe Hooper decided that Leatherface was mentally disabled, shaped by neglect and environment, and that his terror came from his misunderstanding of situations rather than malice. To portray Leatherface authentically, Hansen studied speech patterns and movements at schools for the mentally handicapped, ensuring his performance was never mocking or exaggerated. In the original script, Leatherface's lines are just gibberish, so Hooper worked with Hansen to translate those gibberish lines into gestures and sounds that conveyed meaning without conventional speech. At one point, after carefully crafting a line, Hooper told Hansen that it needed to be redone because it sounded too intelligent. Every single word can compromise the character's unsettling simplicity, so Hansen, clearly upset, later recalled, "My one chance to have a line." That careful balance of menace and vulnerability is part of what makes Leatherface as a character so enduring, and it's also fascinating to consider the meta subtext. Here we have a fictionalized character inspired by a real-life murderer performed in a way that humanizes him. And then decades later, that performance inspires a fictionalized interpretation of the real man, Charlie Hunnam playing Ed Gein in Monster. The cycle loops back in on itself, with the real Ed Gein almost getting completely lost in the process, leaving us with a layered conversation between reality, fiction, and interpretation. So by grounding the horror in some sort of reality, Hansen and Hooper created a character that's as tragic as he is terrifying, and that sort of story structure had reverberations across generations of filmmakers. Nobody had had that sort of depth in a horror movie before. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre made $30 million on its $140,000 budget. It became one of the most profitable independent films of all time and one of the most influential. The masked killer, the final girl, have you ever heard of any of these tropes before? The family of psychos in the middle of nowhere? All straight from this movie. It changed how horror was filmed, edited, marketed, and felt. It inspired Halloween, The Hills Have Eyes, Alien, and an entire generation of filmmakers who realized that terror didn't need to be a monster suit or elaborate effects, just honesty. The film's impact goes beyond the horror genre. It's part Southern Gothic, part documentary. Its grainy realism gave horror a new voice. It's raw, it's angry, and it's politically conscious. But beyond that, it's also one of the most important pieces of American horror commentary. It's a grimy reflection of the country's decay that we are still feeling today. It's about the death of the hippie dream. It's the rot under the white picket fence. It's the sheer terror of realizing that monsters are not underneath your bed. They're sitting down for dinner.
You just hush. It won't hurt none. My old grandpa's the best killer there ever was. I never took more than one lick, they say.
That's everything I've got on the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but please leave a comment down below if I missed anything, and also leave a like on the video if you enjoy what I do here. It really helps let YouTube know it needs to show my videos to more wonderful people like you. And finally, don't forget to subscribe to Nostalgia Mode for more entertainment related videos. Until next time, bye.